Prova, 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 1, 2, 3, pronto, prova. Prova streaming, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pronto, prova, 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 prova. Pronto, prova. Prova, 1, 2, 3, pronto, 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 pronto. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, pronto, prova. Prova, prova, prova. Zoom che conta.
Great, thank you. Yeah. 25, 10, 10, right?
Yes, 25, 10, 10.
Let's say we started then, yes, 25, 25. Okay. So, it's not moving. Moving. Hey, good.
Is it on?
We should be connected to the pen, no? The USB drive.
Yes, so I was gonna ask her. I don't know. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good morning, everybody.
It's fine.
We had another.
We have it.
So, let's start with Augustin.
Okay. Thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure to be here and to present the review on our theme, which is on information and conflict. And I'm co-leading this theme with Maria Petrova, who was not able to be here today. So this is a theme that crosses many other themes. So I'm going to be happy to engage with any themes that feel like there are some things that are missing in what we're going to be discussing, or things that we could be referring to based on what they've done in their review. A quick sort of motivation of the entire theme. Information in general is important in sort of determining how people behave and take economic decisions in general. And it's even more so or more true in conflict environments, because these are environments where typically you will have high stakes. If you think of actors that are involved in violent events or activities, they typically have drastic gains or losses, and that's the usual motivation for engaging, or at least one of the main ones for engaging in these type of activities. If you think of passive agents in the broader economy, they're also sort of facing life-threatening events that disrupt substantially the day-to-day decision-making process. There's also uncertainty. Beliefs play a crucial role, and economic agents are always trying to anticipate what's going to happen next in taking their decisions. So information is going to be crucial on these two dimensions. And one key way through which people are getting information is going to be through the media. So it's going to be interesting to sort of understand how information, media, and conflict are sort of interrelated, and what can we do about them to sort of understand better violence, anticipate it, prevent it, and so on. So we've divided the theme into 3 different sub-themes. The first one is going to be about media in general and conflict, trying to sort of understand how information sort of affects the way in which active violence participants or conflict actors behave. And then there's going to be a second sub-theme that is going to look into the role of information in sort of shaping the economic impact of violence. Basically trying to think about sort of indirect ways in which violence can affect various economic agents in an indirect way. And the last one is going to be about big data, AI, and conflict forecasting, sort of the extent to which you can leverage information to sort of do a good job at forecasting what's going to happen next in terms of violence. So quickly dive into the first one. So we've tried to sort of identify the main channels through which information is going to sort of shape the decision-making of conflict actors. And we've identified 3 main channels. The first one is basically through an incentive channel. And this is something that has been out there in the literature for a while, basically saying that people engage in violence and they decide to sort of start conflicts and whatever, often because there is a disagreement in their sort of capacity to win the confrontation compared to their adversaries, and this is what is sort of leading towards. The incentives also affect sort of the way or the forms in which you want to engage in violence. It's potentially going to affect how sort of the timing of violent acts, and we're going to see examples of these things in sort of various parts of the literature. The second challenge is going to be about persuasion. And this is basically going to be all these papers where you are going to have sort of a core set of leaders in the movement that have a hard sort of way of thinking about the fact that violence is necessary at a certain point in time, and they're trying to convince other people to join just because they need their support or because they need more sort of actors in order to succeed in their endeavor. That's going to be the persuasion channel of information. And then the last one is going to be about coordination, sort of being able to share information across, within groups with different people, sort of helps in increasing the likelihood of success of whatever violent activities you've been planning. And this is typically the case for grassroots movements such as protests. I'm going to try to sort of identify these different channels by looking at 6 different violence or conflict stages that are typically sort of viewed as sub-literatures in the literature. So this way, if someone is interested in a specific one, they can easily sort of like have an idea of like the literature that has been going on there, and then still have this common framework of like how to think about the other types of violence or conflict stages. The first one is going to be on how media affect ongoing conflict. There we're going to have basically all three channels sort of playing a role, and in a way that we can more or less sort of distinguish them. That's not going to be always the case. So on the incentives channels, one key thing that the literature has been able to sort of show is basically how the timing of conflict events, it's highly strategic. So there's evidence that for the Israel and Palestine conflict, for instance, when media attention is sort of busy with like scheduled events in the US, that's when some military operations by the Israeli typically take place, because the idea is that you want to minimize sort of the outcry in public opinion that could sort of be problematic for sort of proceeding with a certain agenda. So the timing is highly strategic. There is also an interesting link between sort of social media and traditional media in sort of how they're reporting conflict events. Is this recent paper, I think, that was presented in the Paris conference earlier this year, where they're basically showing that social media content is influencing substantially what traditional media is reporting on. And then this sort of affects basically public support for either side of different conflicts. And this is an incentive for the actors of these conflicts. Then on the propaganda side, you have a large literature sort of showing how media has a high sort of persuasive power. Some papers have shown that it increases fighting intensity or violence in general. Typical examples are the cases of Rwanda. We also have examples in Nazi Germany, where basically access to certain radio stations sort of help in mobilizing and or sort of getting people engaged into the resistance or into the genocide for the Rwandan case. There are also examples of sort of the persuasion going the other way around, sort of decreasing violence intensity by sort of demobilizing fighters. And one such example was in Central Africa with the Lord Resistance Army. And then on the coordination part, so you also have both the fact that information communication technologies can be sort of increasing the intensity of violence and fighting, sort of allowing different actors to coordinate and talk to each other and things like that. There's also evidence that it could be decreasing the intensity of fighting, especially for terrorist attacks, for the case of Iraq, where basically non-combatant people that are not involved in the violence are able to report to security forces sort of suspicious activities, and then this leads to a decrease in the violence intensity. On post-conflict reconciliation, this is the second sub-literature that we consider, you mostly have papers focusing on the persuasion channel. So there it's about like trying to bring people together after conflict has happened. And as we've seen yesterday in the one of the themes looking at reconciliation and peace building in post-conflict settings, information plays an important role. There's evidence that some pacifying messages that are basically trying to erase ethnic boundaries, for the case of Africa, work quite well for the case of Rwanda and Burundi. There are also examples of substantial backlash of access to information in these settings, either because you have foreign powers sort of trying to fund sort of ethnic tensions for the case of Croatia, or for the case of South Africa with Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where sort of just being exposed again to what has happened during the apartheid period sort of just generates more tensions between people. Then we look into media and xenophobia and ethnic tensions in general. So in terms of opinions and sort of sentiments of people towards those that they consider as the art groups. And there, the overwhelming evidence is basically that media tends to play a negative role, sort of increasing hatred or negative sentiments towards art group. There is surprisingly no evidence that we could actually find on sort of like media and social media sort of bringing us together just by itself, sort of bringing different groups sort of closer to each other. It would be nice if there's a way to show such example in future research, but for the moment, we have not found much evidence on that. Then we have a different sub-literature for sort of people getting into action of like actually committing hate crimes. So one channel is basically first having these negative opinions about the art group, and that then you also have the other channels such as the coordination channel and the incentive channel. So there's evidence that what is happening on social media, sort of Trump putting a target on some communities, for instance, increases the number of hate crimes against these communities. It increases in some settings sort of the fact of having hate crimes that are like more coordinated with multiple perpetrators or multiple acts happening at the same time. Then there is a sub-literature on media and protest. And there you also have all three channels. It's much harder to disentangle them in this setting. So persuasion is at the same time a way of coordinating things. So the better you coordinate, the more persuasive you're gonna appear in front of people you're trying to mobilize for protest. And the more planned in terms of timing and location your protests are, the more you're gonna be able to persuade people, or the easier it's going to be to coordinate. So there's a large literature sort of looking at all these different channels out there. And then the last one is on media and terrorism. You also have in there all three channels, and people have sort of built interesting theories of how there's a symbiotic relationship between terrorists and the media. Dominic has a paper on that. And the idea being that these seem to be sort of true business partners. Like, terrorism relies on the idea that the media is gonna sort of increase the outreach of their attacks. And the media is also interested in sort of like the sensational and the emotional reaction to terrorist attacks, and the fact that it's gonna generate more audience, irrespective of how you actually cover those things. So you have this two-way relationship between them, and then you have incentive aspects of like the timing of different events, sort of, or the coverage of media of previous terrorist attacks increases the likelihood of future terrorist attacks, and things like that. So that's basically the first sub-theme. So there we're really looking into how information affects actors or belligerents or people that are interested in taking an active part in sort of violence. The second one is gonna be looking at how information affects the economic impact of violence on the broader population that is not always engaged in the violence process itself. And in there, information is going to matter for how we should identify the impact of violence on households and firms. So we start with households, and there are basically two reasons why this is going to happen. And there's there's a growing literature trying to look at both. The first one is basically the idea that when people have access to information, then they build expectations over sort of the underlying violence process. And then the beliefs about the underlying violence process triggers changes in their economic decisions that would potentially lead to indirect impacts, in the sense of they would be running away from specific places when they perceive a high risk of violence. You can have provision of services and goods that are disrupted just based on the fact that there is a risk, not necessarily a realization of violence. And then you have fear and all these psychological reactions to sort of the stressful environment. Small literature, hopefully growing one, has basically relied on the fact that based on the pattern of observed violence, you can try to recover the underlying violence process. And if you make the assumption that people have access to information that allows them to have a good sense of what this underlying process is, you can try to figure out how different economic outcomes are sort of reacting to the violence risk. Hannes and Tim Besley have a paper on that in Northern Ireland, looking at how the violence process sort of affects the housing market, sort of going beyond the incidence of the violence. I have a paper in Ivory Coast and Uganda, sort of trying to make that point. The second reason is basically going to have to do with heterogeneity in access to information, or in the way in which media is basically covering violent events. This is going to be shaping the beliefs of economic agents. And there's growing literature trying to isolate sort of this non-mechanical impact of violence by sort of highlighting the role that media is going to be playing in there. There has been a massive sort of focus on specific types of events, mostly mass shootings and terrorist attacks. And the reason is that those are sporadic events that are literally, they take place in a matter of minutes, sometimes hours, and then they generate, most of their effect is gonna come from the fear and the shockwave that they're gonna send to the entire economic activity. And there's evidence that this matters for demand for education. For the case of Kenya, there's evidence that it affects spending behavior with credit card data in a bunch of countries in North Africa. And there's evidence that mass shootings, for instance, in the US sort of have a broader impact on labor market outcomes such as earnings and unemployment, just through this sort of indirect effect. So two key sort of channels have been isolated by this literature. The first one is basically this media multiplier effect, basically the idea that just having a high coverage of terrorist attacks sort of increases, leads a substantial share of people to sort of change their economic behavior and then incur the cost of this indirect exposure to the violence. And then there is this drowning out effect, which is basically saying, so whenever the media is busy with something else, so imagine you have a terrorist attack and at the same time there's a natural disaster that happens right after. So the media is sort of busy with something that they consider to be more sensational or important. These type of attacks tend to have much smaller effects. So you have this sort of important role of the media either amplifying the impact of violent events whenever they have the full media attention. Then there is the part about how violence affects firms and investors through information. And in there, the literature has also focused on mostly financial markets for a bunch of reasons. The main ones being that you have a lot of data available for these type of markets and they play an essential role in the overall economy. The second one being that these markets actually sort of signal very quickly changes in beliefs and expectations of rather sophisticated economic agents across different sectors. And those are typically the kind of people that are literally putting their money where their mouths are. So they are gambling substantial amount of money and they are following through with their beliefs about what markets will look like in the near future or in the long run. There are four key results on this literature. The first one is a fairly standard and anticipated one, which is that financial markets are going to be moving or co-moving with new information about the prospects of war and peace. And there's been a bunch of papers that have shown these things. Interestingly, and this comes from papers that have been looking at historical episodes, there's evidence that the prevailing beliefs during a given historic period do not always coincide with what retrospective analysis of events based on hindsight sort of way of looking at events would suggest. So this is mostly coming from most of the papers use the US Civil War, and then they use historical sort of records of what were the main turning points of the Civil War process, and then they try to see to which extent markets have sort of reacted to these events. And they basically show that some events that historians consider to be not that important, markets have substantially reacted to them. And there were some events where markets, historians thought or considered to be turning points in the violence process, but markets have not reacted to that. So basically, markets provide a snapshot of beliefs and opinions about what's going to happen in the future, but they can be wrong, or at least based on hindsight analysis. It goes even further. Information frictions can lead to drastic divergence in sort of what people think the prospects of peace and war can be. And this can be sort of something that you can see on financial markets. So Mitra has a fantastic paper where with his co-authors, they're looking at the case of the French sovereign bond when Prussia sort of basically cut off communications between Paris and the rest of the provinces. And then they show that these highly traded assets sort of start diverging in equilibrium prices between Paris and the rest of the provinces because those agents started having different beliefs regarding the prospects of peace and war. There's also evidence that firms and investors become more risk averse when you have perceived high risk of violence, looking at sort of the type of assets that they are sort of like investing in when you have uncertainty due to violence. The last sub-theme is basically going to look into big data, AI, and conflict forecasting. There, the idea is to say, well, if information is important for conflict actors in their strategic decisions and things like that, and you have some local elite or even international elite sort of writing about things that are happening around them constantly on a regular basis, we can sort of leverage that information and try to sort of predict or whether there's a high risk of violence happening at the country level at different points in time. So people have used news articles that talk about certain type of events at first to sort of like say, hey, whenever people are talking about protests and riots, at the country level, it's always a process and it tends to be escalating. So you can use that to predict whether that country is going to end up sort of having some more violent episodes. Hannes and some of his co-authors have sort of proposed using topic models to sort of leverage more the information that is contained in these news articles. And then they actually show that you have some topics that are sometimes negatively correlated with violence risk. Basically, when you have people writing a lot, writing less about judicial power and things like that, it's sometimes a good sign that something is going to happen in the future. And these type of, they've been like early warning systems that have been increasingly using big data and machine learning to sort of try to operationalize efficient early warning systems, which is crucial for policymakers. So quickly on gaps on literature that we've identified and interesting research that could be valuable for policymakers. So we've sort of documented that there seems to be a lot of focus in the literature on traditional media, and very few papers have been sort of looking at the role of social media per se and how it matters in all these three sub-themes. So social media is where, so now most people are getting information from, and it works in a fairly different way compared to traditional media. So we think there is a lot of things to be done there across all the three sub-themes. There are underexplored synergies across them as well. So we know very little about sort of how this two-way interaction between conflict actors and passive agents that are suffering the cost of these events, how sort of information sort of generates some sort of reciprocal reactions that would generate the equilibria that we tend to observe in the data, and how that sort of translates into observed violence and the impact of conflict in general. So it'd be interesting to see more of these synergies in future work. And in terms of policy, for the first theme, there are a lot of questions about how can we improve the quality of information that is available to people in terms of the supply or the demand side of information. So there are a lot of things that one can do in this realm. A lot of it gets complicated when you take into account sort of trying to protect civil liberties and making sure that you do not encroach in sort of fundamental rights. So it would be interesting to sort of come up with creative ways to sort of think about how can you sort of improve the supply of information on different media, especially social media, or how can you sort of prompt people to have better demand for information. On the second sub-theme, it would mostly be about sort of, is there a way to equip people to navigate the modern news environment in violence-prone sort of settings? The idea being that there's always going to be information about violent events happening. Can we sort of somehow help people not sort of engage overly into costly sort of risk coping mechanisms or sort of taking certain decisions that would lead to drastic consequences in the future? And for the third sub-theme about forecasting using information, AI has been sort of opening a lot of opportunities for sort of like leveraging information at different levels for forecasting and predictions, and also integrating other dimensions, things like we talked about climate variability and how it affects risk of violence. So all of these can be integrated once you have the capability of like aggregating a substantial amount of data, and AI could be sort of helping in that sense. And I think I'll stay here, and thanks again.
So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, especially to Dominic, Oliver, and all the CPR team for organizing this beautiful conference. But I would like to thank especially Augustin and Maria for having wrote this beautiful piece. Because I will be super quick on the overview, but I really like how they gather all the evidence around the three teams, but even within the three teams, you were able to identify the gaps and the policy recommendation for each sub-team. So it's really easy to follow, and especially is like you need something, you go directly to this sub-item, and it's an excellent reading for people that wants to work in media and not only in media and conflict. So in my brief discussion, I will try to touch these points. These points, first is a suggestion for a potential expansion. The second one are based on the readings that you have in your review, and some evidence that there is around some priorities for policies, and then a little bit of food for thoughts about challenges for future research. The first one is a suggestion, because I mean your review is very comprehensive. You touches a lot of material, but I guess that and it aligns on what you were just discussing. I think that what you can do is probably integrating more what you already have with the literature that is emerging on social media. I mean, and you mentioned that while standard media, it's, let's say, more or less well covered in the conflict and media literature, we don't know a lot about the potential impact on social media. But there is a lot of research that is done and is very recent. I listed a couple of papers that, you see the dates and are very new, relevant contribution and new contribution that really tackle the issue of economics and social media. And one of the problem of this that arises reading from this literature is that are the platform that are designed to amplify toxic and polarizing content. And so this is a problem because it creates some feedback loops that enhance the risk of polarization and conflict and the consequences. So while there is this literature on economics of social media, it would be nice to have just a couple of items that make a bridge, just to say, well, we know a lot about traditional media and conflict. We don't know anything about, or we know less about what is the potential links between these two literatures that at the end of the day, they are really related. Then related to this, I have a couple of requested suggestions for policies. And the first one is the role of artificial intelligence and the media amplification. And so we know that most of these platforms, they rely on artificial intelligence systems that amplify harmful content. And this is basically because of the fact that this type of let's say content is more likely to engage people. Hence, since you want to, as a platform, maximize your revenues or the engagement, there is a risk of enhancing the toxic content in this platform. And so what we can do, well, as policy suggestion, is to propose to policymakers to regulate the risk of the high-risk artificial intelligence features and potentially, but again, this is wishful thinking, correct platform incentives, in order to at least be transparent, in order to require how this engagement algorithm, they might or may not amplify this toxic content and eventually support changes in the design to reduce this spillover effect. Is it feasible or not? Well, there are some very recent policy initiatives that actually they try to, on paper, ban certain type of practice that are related to the use of artificial intelligence. But at the end of the day, we don't know whether this kind of thing works or not. The second policy suggestion is based on, again, some items that you touched during your talk, and is related also to what a lot of people here in the room they are doing, that is something that connects to the social listening. So we know that there are efforts, and excellent efforts, to build up conflict early warning system that rely on news media. But if you want, conflict is an equilibrium outcome. So when there is conflict, it's already too late. So while you can use news to predict conflict, or the conflict risk will be nice if we are equipped with a more, let's say, broad battery of tools that actually we can use to understand to monitor in real time disinformation and hate narratives. And the idea is that we would like to have some sort of toolbox to flag rising tension, to understand mobilization risk in the online world. Is it feasible? Well, not really. In the sense that one of the problem is that there is a huge data bottleneck, and this, has become more clear because now we don't have access to any type of Twitter data. Facebook data is restricted, and the only platform that allows you to gather some data is YouTube. And one of the complexity of this kind of potential policy priorities is that most of the time the policy response is fragmented. Narratives, especially the hate narratives, are not local, but most of the time they spread worldwide. And the only monitoring effort that is done right now is very local at the national level, and on top of that is very restricted in term of time frame. So usually you monitor the fake news dissemination only around the election. But I mean, probably if you do this kind of monitoring only around a certain point in time, probably it's too late to deploy the correct measure. What about the future research? Again, based on your reading of the literature and based on what is out there, I have two policies, two suggestions in terms of future research. I will be very quick since I have 1 minute. The first one is related to try to understand whether we can reverse the effect of media. So most of the papers that are out there, they show a long-term effect of the media, especially the media influence and the propaganda. And so, for example, there is the paper by Desmond Ang that shows that even after 60 years, places that display Birth of a Nation, they still have different response in terms of racism. So the question is, first of all, we should try to unpack why there is this persistent of media influence and whether we can deploy some initiatives in order to undo the negative element of media. Then, and I will be very quickly because you already touched on that, I think that if you look at how many papers there are on media negative and that have a negative effect versus the one that have a positive effect is an unbalanced battle, because you have hundreds of papers on negative media and very scattered evidence about the positive effect of media. And so I think that what we should do, especially because I hope that we will facing this type of let's say this evidence right now, we need this evidence right now. We need to understand how media can promote the post-conflict healing. And on top of that, whether there are some narratives that spread, let's say, a supportive reconciliation without having the risk of creating a common enemy. Because most of the papers that show right now is if you have a positive effect of media on reconciliation, this is usually done at the expense of some minorities. And so is it possible to have like this kind of gold standard where you have a positive effect of media without having the risk of creating discriminatory behavior in the community? But apart from that, was excellent, and I really thank Agustina and Maria for this beautiful piece. Thanks a lot.
Okay, we have time for questions, or do you want to reply to the discussion first? No, let's take questions.
Thanks. I wonder about the reverse use, like when autocratic regimes reduce access to social media and then reduce the ability of coordination from opponents, for example. I know that some political scientists have worked on that, whether there's any good empirical evidence and whether that's something that could be part of the research agenda, which is the opposite effect, right?
We are working on a crossover from this risk literature to the EPU, you know, the Baker et al. Kind of work on economic policy uncertainty. And since that's super used a lot across all kinds of literatures, right? Because it's a huge literature, the EPU, every month a new working paper comes out with that. And I think that maybe you could mention that, uncertainty, like maybe conflict is increasing uncertainty as well.
Sorry.
Thanks, Augustine. I wonder if I had the impression, I don't know much about this literature, sorry, but that much of the approach taken to the information that's distributed by the media seems to treat it like as if it's exogenously given or it just drops from heaven. But especially if we're thinking about changes in the supply of media information, is there work that actually treats the media as an actor and thinks about the incentives of media providers, and given that they have incentives, how that therefore is interpreted by the people who receive the information? It just seemed that there wasn't much in what you were talking about. And that seems like a really naive view in the literature, right? In the sense that you'd think it comes from some sort of set of incentives. I could see that that was implicit in the social media platform models that were talked about at the end. But in terms of traditional media, it seems like that's super important, especially if you're going to ask questions about how we would change that information flow.
Thank you.
Yeah, also ask one question.
I'm gonna, yeah, sorry, it's really important. Yeah. Thank you.
So what didn't come across very clear to me was the question about the credibility and quality of the information that is shared. So it's only about, is there information that is shared, but not so much is that information credible, is it perceived as credible, and also the role. I think it's related in terms of strategic interventions, like all the Russian bots that are being used to misguide people and change the perception even in Western countries. Is there research on that? I have no idea.
Yeah, thanks. Those are very great comments. So on whether blocking access to social media helps or whether there's evidence on that. So policymakers do seem to really think so. So there are many instances of protests and riots where that's the go-to tool. Either you cut off electricity completely or you restrict internet access and things like that. So there's no academic evidence that it works though. So there is this paper on China showing how restrictions on access to social media led to people using VPNs and sort of still managing to find a way to sort of have access to information that they were not supposed to have access to. So there's the question of at which point is it actually efficient? Like, can you actually fully control? And if you don't fully control, can it actually be a reason to sort of generate more support against you and things like that? And I think there's little, like, we did not come across any paper, and if any of you knows of any paper looking into these things, we'll be super happy to add that to the review. Yes, uncertainty. So we try to talk about general uncertainty in the draft, and yes, we can add more on what Hannes has suggested. So the question on media attention and strategic behavior on that, so that I think it's spot on. So what the literature has done so far is basically try to leverage exogenous sources of variation that affect the extent to which media is paying attention to certain events. So you have things happening, but then you have a big natural disaster showing up. So the incentive of the media is to cover the big disaster rather than the violent event. And then there's evidence that if you look at the indirect effect of these type of events, it's much smaller. There's also evidence of you have less, I don't know, for terrorism, less terrorist attacks following up these type of things. But there's a deeper question of in normal times with the standard incentives of traditional media and social media platforms, are they imposing any restrictions on themselves on how they're reporting on events, especially when this is not dictated by political purposes? So we know if you want to think about, I don't know, going to war in Iraq, you had some media outlets that were fully on board. So those seem to be political decisions, but when it comes to just decentralized events like mass shootings and things like that, are they just following audience requirements, or is there some deep level sort of strategic behavior from their perspective? And I think we know very little about these things, and it's gonna matter for how we wanna police them, or like the type of policies you can put in place to sort of force them to be responsible one way or another. And that there's just not any evidence that we couldn't cover that would sort of like point to sort of these incentives from the media. And I think that's a big part of the policy question of like, what do you do? And whatever you do, how do you make sure that no one misuses this power for other purposes? Because it means that they would be controlling one way or another the information that is out there. On the quality of information, there's not much about that. And that's actually the worst part, which is being exposed to any information seems to have some effect on some people. It doesn't matter whether the information is credible or not. Just, I mean, some people will self-select into not consuming that information, for instance, if they have a strong sense. Like think of Twitter, and a lot of people in academia leaving Twitter, but you still have a mass of people there. So anything that is coming out there, there's going to be some marginal people that are going to be engaging with the content and potentially sort of forming opinions based on that. And it just looks like the quality is irrelevant. As long as you keep repeating it, people will just gonna believe that, or some people will believe that this is the true information. And that was our sort of feeling of like literature, and there is little work on whether it changes anything on based on the veracity of information or not. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Since we're very late, we have a short break of 15 minutes and we reconvene at 11 sharp here to get back to the program.
Oh, no.
Yeah, I mean, there's, yeah. Yeah, it's a lot to do. Great stuff, man. Okay, I hope I did justice to your amazing paper. No, very kind.
Is there another one? Yeah, and ask them.
I think I have my own.
No, this we have it. It's just probably they take it a bit.
Okay.
I believe so.
Hey, how you doing?
Yeah, so I think they take it down. We have enough. This is
Well, I don't know. No coffee for you? I think I will have some.
quindi conseguenza della... Ma che faccio? Sì, è un altro, probabilmente è un altro. Vabbè, chiedo magari cioè, la persona che stava moderando.
Sì. Perché tu questo è un altro clicker?
Sì, 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 ma non so dove.
Ah, no, guarda.
Ora funziona? Ah, ok. Andando. Non è piaciuto, non è piaciuto.
Aspetta, aspetta.
Yes?
Secondo me qui prende meglio.
Ok. Ok, perfetto.
No?
Oh.
Sì, forse...
La connessione non lo so. Vabbè, comunque, faccio sta che abbiamo risolto. Bene, grazie.
Sto preparando la...
Mhm.
Ci sta tutto.
Sì. Ah, bene.
About so here it's also about the perpetrators in some sense, like making them like flags. But I think works. We have a
Yeah.
perfect. Thank you. I don't think recommendation already.
Okay, then let's start with the last session.
Should I go?
Okay, please.
Right. Well, it's great to see you all again. So I'm going to be talking a bit about breaking through the ethnic growth trap. Now, I don't need to tell anyone in this room that civil conflicts continue, particularly in the poorer states, and it's not just civil conflicts, as was discussed before. There's a lot of interstate wars as well. I think it's also important to recognize, though, that history is not fate. That there are places which experienced a lot of conflict historically, but conflict has stopped, while conflict in other places have kind of been persistent and emerged. Even though a casual person might look at this and say, well, this is very much a distance to the equator kind of thing or something like that, historically that was not the case. And we've seen a lot of violence around the world. I think it's important to note, though, that there are places which were, that were historically at conflict, particularly Japan, that I'll come to later, that were ethnically divided, that have been at peace for quite some time, at least internally. And I want to get back to that as well. So, so as we talked about in Paris a few months ago, there's a lot of the literature has talked about basically antagonisms, where ethnicity is really seen as a kind of a dividing line and potential antagonism. There are different ways of measuring ethnic diversity. There's the ethno-linguistic fractionalization index, which Alcina and Lafarara have shown has led to a reduced growth, particularly when places are poor. Ethno-linguistic more fractionalized places don't grow as fast, but when they are rich, it seems to be a benefit. So there's a potential complementarity when you're all affluent, but there's a problem when you're poor, which again kind of suggests that there might be a trap that we might be stuck in, because places which are poor and conflictual because of ethnicity might also experience more conflict. And as you know, there are famous papers which show that ethnically polarized places also experience a lot of conflict. And the fractionalization polarization thing has a lot to do with the size of relatively small places versus big places, right? So what we talked about last time is, there could be a potential feedback loop between ethnic divisions and conflict, and poverty or lack of growth. This connects as well with lower public goods. There's an extensive literature, as you know, connecting these things as well. And so given that there's mutual feedback between these things, we want to begin to see how can we break out of this potential ethnic growth trap. And there are different kind of aspects of this. There might be ethnic differences in preferences. There might be, ethnic divisions might be economically grounded. So there's inter-ethnic competition or a lack of complementarity. There's a question about ethnically based mobilization. Why is it that groups, even if you have a marker, actually decide to mobilize and have the capacity to organize around those lines versus other types of more inclusive and expansive lines? How does this affect formal institutions? And what are the effects on kind of spillovers and the destruction of capital? So mostly, I think the areas of research that are needed are in this box in the middle. This kind of motivates what we think of as kind of three pillars that are really essential for understanding how to break through the ethnic growth trap. One is that just a simple diagnosis. Why is it, if it's so costly to live in ethnically divided societies when you're poor, that people choose to do so, or these ethnic divisions persist? Why don't people move? Why do people co-locate given that situation? As I'm going to argue, those processes actually really shape the potential for development and the potential solutions in a very context-specific way, but also with generalities that can be made as well. The second part is, a second pillar is how to think about how formal institutions and effective governance can help us deal with some of these challenges. And the third pillar is about networks, informal institutions, and constructive contact. And we talked, I think Salma and talked a bit about that yesterday, right? So, these are the three pillars. And one thing, so there are a key set of questions I think are open and need to be addressed more in the literature. One is, as we mentioned, what are the sources of ethnic polarization in different contexts? Guaranieri 2025 has a lovely kind of description of some of those sources, but I think much more work in that area needs to be done. Are there opportunities, for example, interethnic complementarities that could be leveraged to bring about peace? And we think about ethnic divisions leading to fewer public goods provision. I'm going to give you examples of ethnic divisions actually leading to more public goods provision because of the presence of complementarities. A third question, as I mentioned, is where does internal ethnic organization come from? That I think we really need to unpack more. I think we're just scratching the surface in that regard. On the second pillar of strengthening governance, one thing I'm going to describe, which I think is fairly unique to the ethnic dimension of conflict, is this phenomenon of ethnic cronyism, that minority groups, often affluent minority groups, will try to buy protection from people who are in charge. And this can lead to an undermining of democracy. It can lead to internal ethnic conflict as well. And as a result, we need to figure out how minority groups can actually find alternative solutions, or how we can help such groups be able to find alternatives of buying protection and thus undermining sort of the democratic process. There's work on power sharing that folks in the room have worked on, which I think is also really important, and more research needs to be done. Also, I think this question of where do we find venues for mediating conflict? Who can in a multipolar society, who can be honest brokers in an environment where we, I think it used to be fairly clear who those folks were, but now it's increasingly less so. Who do we turn to be a venue for peace? Then on the networks and positive contact pillar, can we actually leverage different types of not just contact, interactions, having a beer kind of things, but actual economic types of interactions, for example, financial interactions and business interactions in new or existing spheres to bring people together in different ways? Can we build interethnic teams, facilitate new cross-cutting and national identities through a variety of different processes? Some folks have talked about this like yesterday as well. And finally, can we leverage traditional leadership structures or social networks to support such endeavors? Can they, instead of those being sort of potential sources of organization and conflict, can they be leveraged to support peace? So these are, I think, the key areas where I think there's much more work to be done. And a lot of, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of them and kind of give an overview of some of ideas which I think are pretty interesting. In particular, these ones. So, I'm not going to belabor this, but, I had a framework to think about how, basically motivated by the Indian case of why was it for 1,000 years, Hindus and Muslims in medieval ports lived in peace and tolerance, even in environments where there were waves of pogroms happening right next door around them. And, actually in an EP article in 2019, I kind of wrote a simple model, but basically here's the upshot was, there was 3 conditions which are really helpful to support peace. In fact, they were necessary, weekly necessary to support peace. One is that there were complementary relationships between the ethnic groups. There was, for 1 month every year for 1,000 years, Muslims, the Hajj was the largest textile market in the world, and you had to be a Muslim to go to Mecca. And this induced complementarity between Hindus and Muslims on these ports. Which were very hard. Further, it was very hard for even a large group of Hindus to replicate that source of complementarity. Unlike human capital or physical capital that can be expropriated or seized, this is a trading network and it's hard to expropriate or replicate. Thirdly, there was kind of also beneficially, there was a non-violent, credible mechanism to share the gains from trade. In principle, unlike many ethnic networks where you have to be born into it in order to be part of it, in principle, any Muslim could go on the pilgrimage because, any person could become Muslim in principle. So anytime that there was kind of a relative demand for Muslim services in Indian ports, you'd have conversion or immigration, and this would lead to the terms of trade going towards the local population. Further, there's incentives to build norms, beliefs, and organizations which reinforced these incentives for peace over time. So these ports actually competed with each other to attract the Muslim minority communities, and you see legacies of that around the country. So, I'm going to go through this very rapidly. This is what medieval South Asia happened. There were ports, there were places which Muslims ruled for a long time. This reflects their ethnic demography. On the eve of partition and independence, but places which had lots of Muslims tended to have more conflict, but not these port towns, even though places around them had a lot of violence, right? So further in survey data, these places actually showed less interethnic inequality and continued interethnic specialization. And you can kind of see legacies, direct legacies of the institutions and the norms, including, Gandhi himself came from one of these port towns. So, and it's in the data too. Now, moving to Africa, which we kind of care about a lot in this endeavor, you see some, Montalvo and Reynolds-Kettle have an interesting paper where they actually show that oftentimes we think about ethnic borders as being places where conflict happens. And I'm going to show you that that was often the case. But in certain environments, you get the development of markets also occurring on these interstices, and this is where development also happens. And so I think we often conflate these border areas as kind of places where bad stuff goes on, but also good stuff goes on too. And I think separating when one happens versus the other, I think is crucial and understudied in the African context. On the other hand, as we kind of, there's also a lot of work on the political construction of ethnic identity, which so Posner, Dan Posner has this famous paper that many of you are familiar with, comparing Malawi and Zambia and the Chewa and Timbukwa ethnic populations. And basically he did he studied villages on either side of the border, which had both populations. And he found even though this border is fairly arbitrary and very kind of fluid, on one side of the border, on the Malawian side, the Chewas and Timbukwas were in conflict with each other. And on the Zambian side, they were actually friends. They said, we are one. And this really had to do with the political incentives because these groups are very small, but kind of geographically aligned in Zambia. So they had an incentive to work together in the Zambian context. Whereas in Malawi, they actually, they have a chance of actually ruling the country. So in fact, Hastings Banda, the former Life president, was from one of these communities. So in one case, they're in competition politically. In the other case, there's political complementarity. Oops, sorry. So more generally, as I was describing, even there's these economic and political incentives for complementarity and competition, but there's also a question of even absent that, where do the group get the potential to organize more easily versus less easily? And there's a number of kind of things in the literature about why this might come about. For example, Ben NK has this idea about disgust and kinship ties providing organization. Moscone, Nunn, and Robinson talk about segmentary lineages. Moscone and Sek talk about Itwika ceremonies and these other things. I've been with Stephen Wilkinson, I've been studying the role of exogenous assignment to combat, particularly under places which were the colonial rulers decided were martial races versus others. And so this just gives you a kind of an image of where the conflicts are happening historically in red crosses, where they're happening kind of more recently in ACLED battles. And you see that there are some which are on the interstices of these, segmentary lineage borders, but there are also some that are kind of on these borders of places which were mobilized in the Second World War and were seen as martial races by the British and the French actually recruited pretty much everybody. I kind of along those lines, I think there's an interesting thing to be seen about how complementarity can actually be engineered by military veterans themselves. And so one example is actually of a former student of mine who was an army captain in the Indian Army, and he resigned his commission because he thought the Indian Army approach to peace was not working. And he created this organization called Business Alternatives to Peace and Reconciliation. Basically, the first thing he tried was the opportunity cost approach, microfinance. Let's build local development, people won't want to go to war. However, what this actually was working until it stopped working because the insurgents then started taxing the microfinance operations, and the government banned this in some ways. So in some ways, the Indian government saw microfinance as financing conflict, right? So in that sense, a different alternative he turned to was then basically creating organizations which could induce complementarity. So in the northeast of the country, in Manipur, which has one of the longest lasting insurgencies in the world, he basically created an organization which would basically source artisanal products from both groups and had them work together in such a way that they needed to cooperate. And so what seems to have happened is that this reduced the incentives for violence over time. It was, again, impossible to replicate or expropriate because these are very artisan specific. I think these kinds of approaches are very promising, but need to be evaluated. So I think one area that we want to think about is can we think about incubating these types of business relationships more generally? In fact, thank you. In fact, in Africa, there are organizations that do just this. So the Aga Khan Foundation, it's actually has a long history in Indian medieval ports. They were originally from the Middle East, but mostly in most recent history, they were based in India in these trading relationships. As many of you know, it's not something I'm personally proud of, but South Asians are often in Africa are often involved in a fair amount of corruption shenanigans. So you think about South Africa, you think about the Goldenberg scandal with Daniel Arap Moi. And this is, I think, has this connection with this ethnic cronyism incentive that we talked about before. If you're an affluent minority, what do? You want to buy protection from people. And who do you buy protection from? You buy protection from the person who can give it to you most easily, and that's going to be the guy at the top. And oftentimes you'll see this, we see this pattern in Indonesia and with Suharto and the Chinese ethnic minorities I'm going to get to in a moment. You see it in Africa as well. And this creates a lot of inter-ethnic tension, as well as reducing, providing an alternative source of revenue for dictators or would-be dictators in such a way that could undermine democracy as well. However, this Malay community, highly organized, chose different paths, and I talk about it a bit in the paper. They, for example, instead of giving money to the boss, they endowed things like dispensaries. So you can still go, the oldest dispensary in Zanzibar was endowed by one of these merchants. This is not just a one person thing, it's actually a pattern of behavior. They even have a company, an organization called the Industrial Promotion Services, which matches Ismailis and non-Ismailis along complementary lines in order to build inter-ethnic business relationships. And they've done more than 1,000 such projects. I think this is a kind of thing that it begs for research and evaluation, because I think it is a very promising way forward. Now, as we talked about, oftentimes, however, this is not what happens. This is Ray Fishman's famous paper, which she shows that companies which are closer to Suharto, and what happens when Suharto gets a cold, and it shows that if Tommy Suharto is on your board, your stock price tends to fall dramatically every time Suharto gets sick. Whereas if you're unconnected, you tend to be inured from these types of things. As we discussed, given these ethnic cronyism incentives, the Chinese ethnic minority was often in these highly connected types of spheres with the Suharto government. And when it fell, there was dramatic anti-Chinese violence in Indonesia. And some of those tensions are still bubbling under the surface there as well. So finance can often be seen as a corrupting influence in some ways when interacted with the ethnic cronyism type of incentive. However, one question is, could it work more generally? Because finance is really at its heart about sharing the future in credible ways. And so different governments have tried to do this, like in Malaysia, after massive ethnic rioting against the Chinese minority, the new economic policy introduced 30% of ethnic Chinese profits would go into a trust redistributed to the Bhumiputra population, literally the sons of the soil. In South Africa, as you know, from 2001 onwards, there have been these Black economic empowerment projects. So if you have 20% Black ownership, you get procurement advantages before the government. In Namibia, when I was there a few years ago, they were actually thinking about implementing a similar type of process, though they chose not to do so. Now, it's hard to say that these things have been good for peace. N is equal to 2, but I want to kind of say that it does seem that conflict could have been less relative to some counterfactuals. Now, however, it is also the case that these are perceived as ethnic taxes, which kind of reinforce ethnic divisions. If you're being taxed on the basis of your ethnicity, this kind of kicks the can down the road. And I think many people see that there's an injustice there to some extent also. But I want to say, well, thank you. So in the paper, I discussed some of our research on one of the remarkable cases of economic development in the world, which is that of Japan in the 19th century. So Japan in the 19th century, I think coming especially from a South Asian background, is incredibly remarkable to me. It had a more entrenched caste system than India does. You had the samurai who ran 1.8 million. They were hereditary warrior administrators. They had a monopoly over the right to bear arms. You had the monopoly over surnames, hairstyles. If you disrespected a samurai, you could legally be could legally execute you. This didn't happen a lot along the equilibrium path. Basically, people understood you did not want to disrespect a samurai, but it was in principle the case that this could happen. Further, even though Japan had been at peace for a long time, they had remilitarized in the aftermath of the American kind of forcible opening of the country to kind of fight a civil war, the Boshin War, which put the emperor back on the throne of Japan. But they were also the ones who were most likely to lose from the modernizing reforms of the new Meiji government. We've seen this movie before. You see a highly militarized, organized group being facing loss of all of its privileges. Chances are you're going to get a conflict, and in fact, there was such a conflict. Japan itself was one of the world's most fractured polities, but within a generation, it succeeded in rapid modernization and centralization. And I think a good question is to understand how this happened, despite all of these things stacked against it. And I think part of the story is that actually the government of Japan, learning from history, learning from the examples of the US and of England, decided instead of the traditional rights obligations each samurai had, to give them bonds. They gave them government of Japan bonds. Further, they wouldn't allow them to sell these bonds, but they allowed them to use them to invest in banks. So the bank owners were required to capitalize national banks with 80% government bonds, samurai bonds, 20% currency from commoners. So these are inter-ethnic business ventures, in other words. There was a dramatic expansion of bank branches from 7 to 150 in a 3-year period, so much so that they had to block further. They just temporarily stopped it because there was just too many banks being formed in this period. So these are, as I mentioned, cross-ethnic institutions. And what you see is that violent samurai revolts against these modernization processes seems to have ended. And instead, the samurai began to peacefully protest first for what was called ex-samurai rights, but then they became constitutional rights as well. So arguably, they really took the samurai and gave them incentives to be, pro-peace incentives in a big way through financial incentive ways. And so, one useful thing we can do is that as a samurai, you had to live in the castle towns. And these castle towns used to dominate their countryside, their local domains. And now the domains are disappearing because of the Meiji reforms. Sorry, I have 1 minute left. Okay. But they find a new raison d'etre by creating national banks in these places because they have the samurai with the bonds, they create the banks. So local samurai, poorer samurai invested in local banks, invested in local silk and cotton merchants, so you don't want to maraud locally. But the big guys, like the big guys at the top, the daimyos, they had them invested in the special bank, which was in national integration projects. The Kozoku Bank, which was in railways, is actually to finance the civil war against the rebels as well. So, so inspired by this, we've done field experiments in Israel, where we found that giving people shares in Palestinian and Israeli stock has made them more financially literate and more willing to support the peace process and vote for parties that do so, to resist populism in the Brexit referendum and to support climate change in reforms in the United States as well. So I'm going to skip all of that and just end by saying, I think that there's a lot of, I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg here in terms of what ethnic conflict has been around for a long time, but ethnic solutions have also been around for a long time. I think we can leverage what we know as economists to solve some of these problems. And I think that this is really a big area that ReCIPE and our initiative can really contribute to. So with that, I'm going to step aside and hear from Eleonora. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks so much, Sumitra, for this nice overview. Thanks also, Dominic and Oliver, for having me in this amazing place, meeting so many interesting people, and having the opportunity to read and think about this very valuable review, which is super comprehensive, written by someone who has contributed a lot to this literature, so you understand how challenging this must have been for me, but I'll give it a try anyway. So I think many of us in the room have contributed to this trend of literature that, over the last decades has uncovered the economic effects of ethnic diversity and also the political economy effects. And mostly what we found is that it generates a wide range of potentially negative outcomes, from poverty to conflict to low public goods provision. Now, I think, and from Soumitra's review, I think it emerges very clearly that we have put relatively less effort into understanding what are the interventions, the policies or institutions that can actually mitigate these ethnic divisions and actually harness diversity for positive ends. So this paper is very timely, also given the world we live in. And I think there are two main contributions of it that at least I can see. So the first thing it does that I think is super valuable is to integrate all these strands of research that all of us have contributed to under the conceptual framework of an ethnic growth trap. And I think while, Soumitra has explained this very well, so the ethnic growth trap is this idea, this mutual feedback loop between ethnic divisions leading to, conflict potentially, but also low public good provision, lack of growth, everything reinforcing each other. And the contribution here is that while previous literature has examined single elements of this trap, it was quite refreshing, at least to me, to see everything being put together for the first time under a unified framework. So I think the framework is helpful in and of itself, also as an intellectual exercise for us and our students, but I think it's also key for us to take this step forward and try and understand how to break through the ethnic growth trap. And this is where the research gaps are the largest. And what Soumitra has done for us is, put together what we know so far of all the micro to macro approaches that seem to have worked in specific settings. So he provides example of individual level interventions that foster contact between people belonging to different groups, but also investments in those informal institutions that harness complementarities between groups, as well as more to the macro level, right, investing in strengthening governance institutions. And really what I liked is just how Soumitra in the review leveraged this framework that he provides to then identify solutions on how to break it. So I just have 3 comments. I think all of them are things that came to mind that maybe one could think of expanding on, although, as I said, the review is already very comprehensive. So my first comment pertains perhaps the first pillar that Soumitra's talked about. So first of all, we need to diagnose what are we talking about, which ethnic divisions matter, right? So we need to understand what divisions are that propel this trap. And I think maybe some additional room of discussion could be devoted not just about the origins of these divisions, like historical origins, for instance, colonization, right, putting together such different groups in the same jurisdictions, but also perhaps the nature of ethnic divisions or divisions in general. So I think the literature has focused a lot on ethnicity, and that has already been quite challenging, given that what is an ethnic group? Is it about language? Is it about ancestry, religion? This is very context specific and really hard to measure already. But I think maybe the literature could take additional steps forward in trying to uncover other markers that may matter, perhaps more in the modern world. So divisions that emerge from values, beliefs, norms, and which values, beliefs, and norms matter the most in generating divisions that then generate a trap. There is this recent paper by Desmet and co-authors that try to measure these alternative sources of division. And it would be also interesting to combine these approaches, right? So understand whether these alternative sources of polarization transcend these deep-rooted divisions, or whether they even reinforce them. So I think future research should indeed incorporate these alternative layers and studying them, and also understanding whether they are replacing or reinforcing existing ethnic cleavages. So that was my first comment. Second comment pertains the other two pillars that you bring up in trying to understand solutions. And here you give really a nice overview of very different interventions potentially. I learned a lot from this part of the review. And you devote a lot of space, and rightly so, to 19th century Japan. So this was a miracle, the example of something that really worked. There was this, you explained it well, I don't need to repeat it, this caste-based hierarchy, and financial reforms actually really managed to overcome these cleavages. And when reading about Japan, I kept on thinking whether the structure of divisions also may matter for us to understand which solutions are most exportable. So the case of Japan, it's a success story, but it's also, I think, very peculiar. The nature of the divisions in Japan may be shared in other contexts like India, you mentioned it. But more generally, what I thought is, does the vertical versus more horizontal nature of division perhaps matter in understanding what solutions may work? So what worked in 19th century Japan with these really institutionalized hierarchies via this caste system perhaps may not work in a society that's more horizontal, where groups maybe were forced to collocate, etc. So I think there's room for more research about this. First of all, measurement. Can we measure the vertical or horizontal nature of divisions? And second, can we assess if this nature or this distinction matters, or maybe not, in fueling the ethnic growth trap, and also how it interacts with reforms and interventions to overcome these divisions? So final point, I don't know how am I doing on time. Okay, perfect. So you mentioned this in the conclusion, and there is a little bit of this when you discuss governments, institutions, but I thought maybe a little more space could be devoted to the role of identity. So at which level does identity manifest? So is it the ethnicity, social group? Is it about the nation? And how key is this expression of identity is to fuel this trap? And then perhaps bringing a little bit more of the literature on explicitly nation building. I know it's a bit in this umbrella of governance, but you were not super explicit about this. And there is a review also by Dominic and Katia on this, but really, how can we foster shared national identity on top of existing group identities? And it would be nice to flesh out like which nation building strategies have worked, especially in societies where groups were brought together artificially. I'd be super interested to know more, for instance, in countries that were born via colonization, so through coercive processes. And I want to leave by saying that it's a big challenge also to understand how can we achieve this unity and break through this trap. Sorry, that was more or less same thing. Without erasing diversity, right? Preserving cultural identities and diversity. And we know from literature and innovation that diversity is good for many things. And so the challenge really for political economists and political scientists is to understand how to achieve this balance. Thanks a lot. This was a really valuable public good that provided. Thanks.
Want to reply? Questions?
So thanks for both fantastic presentations and discussion. I just want to add another example that sort of resembles a little bit to your samurai example. The reform in China was accompanied by Deng Xiaoping's policy to retire all the hardliner generals, and at the same time giving them a lot of benefits, but taking them out of power. And the comparative example is what happened in Vietnam, maybe like less than a decade later, in which the reform was still inclusive of the hardliners in terms of ideologues, like ideologically supporters who came from a military background, essentially. And again, there's no evidence, but I would speculate that that could be one reason why the reform in Vietnam took longer and was less drastic than what happened in China.
Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering if are there examples of conceptual work on the existence of the ethnic growth trap? No. There's no models of, no.
Well, let me first say thank you, Eleonora. That was fantastic. And please send me your slides if you may. And QA, I think that was a great observation. I'd love to learn more and I'd love to chat with you about it. Siwana, I mean, I think it's really, as you know, traps can be generated in a variety of different ways as long as things aggregate to the same level. So I think that's the basic conceptual framework of it, that, there's basically, these, I think Matteo kind of put it really well yesterday about, these strategic complementarities versus substitute types of things which can generate these types of phenomena. But I think the fact that they all reinforce, except at high levels of income, suggests to me that empirically it's the case that, either you're in one, so like a bang type of situation that could emerge. But it could be formalized fairly straightforwardly, I'd imagine.
Thanks. Thank you. I thought this was tremendously interesting. I wonder if you can say something about the construction of identity and the construction of ethnicity and the salience of those identities, because a lot of these ethnic identities only became salient or important, in the 20th century, for example, right? So I wonder whether we're reifying these cleavages just by even emphasizing something like complementarities rather than, thinking more about the construction of ethnicity to begin with.
I think that there's a lot of truth to the fact that there's political incentives for making certain things salient. I think Dan Posner's work is very, is not just is a really important version of many papers which have this flavor. But at the same time, I think it is not the case that these things did not exist before the 20th century. I mean, you can see these patterns in the 19th century. You can see it much earlier. I've studied India, the relationship in Hindus, Muslims, going back to the beginning of those relationships, and these things change over time. Whether you call Muslim Turuska a Turk versus a Muslim, these things are different, but there are distinctions, and they have been important politically going all the way back. And so I think it is important to kind of see where things come from and why people in different places are, see folks as people you party with or have celebrations with versus are in antagonistic relationships. But I think it does go back a long way in some places. And so understanding the historical determinants, I think, is a crucial part of finding the solution. And it won't be the same solution in different places. If it is politically constructed, then maybe the solution is different than if it does have this long history going back 1,000 years. Does that make sense?
So I wanted to go back to one of the points by Leonora. So there are reasons why the different ethnic group emerge and persist. This is a bit under-investigated. There are stories around and so on and so forth, but it's not by chance. So this ethnic group do something. Sometimes they emerge because they needed to, say, stay separated from the other, or they benefited, or maybe they were marginalized. But more generally, they also solve problems. They have coordination, they have local public good provision, and so on and so forth. So the general impression in the literature is that conflict across group is kind of an avoidable byproduct of the fact that you have group, and this group have some internal working. So the point by Leonora, I think, is the key one. So the question here is not as much getting rid of these ethnicities, but is really try to understand how they work and how you can actually, say, create situation where you have some scope for sharing resources such that this group, without giving up their identity, cooperates. But by my point is that if you really want to go that way, we need to understand, irrespective of conflict, what are the drivers of the formation and persistence of this ethnic group. I mean, I'm a bit self-interested because with Elena, we had a long-term project on that, but that was very specific. But more generally, I think this is an issue. We tend to take ethnic group as given. The example of the samurai, I mean, is a successful example, not just because of the finance, but the fact that this group had rules and connection and network that were redirected. And these are all the success example. Somehow they root, they flip, they exploit the fact that you have a group working, so solving coordination problem, and you just redirect it. So that is the big challenge to me somehow. I mean, it's just a free thought, but.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think part of the core of the paper is to say, how can we harness, these ethnic, identities and the economic resources, the networks that come with being of a particular ethnicity for development. And, we see examples like in the Ismaili community in Zanzibar, where they are increasing public goods provision and doing these things precisely because these ethnicities and these networks these exist. So I think being cognizant of that allows us to come with new solutions. And I think you're absolutely right that I think oftentimes we do treat these things as potential antagonisms and when they are potential opportunities as well. And so thinking about it, this is where context kind of matters and understanding the history it does. So that's like the first pillar of the theme.
Okay. Thank you very much. Then we move on to the last of this.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so thank you very much for staying for the last session. So this is the theme on gender and armed conflict, and I'm working on this with Mika Sviacci at Princeton. So I would say of all the themes, this is the one that's the least covered by economists. So I really see this sort of theme much more in the realm of political science. It's a little bit difficult for us to figure out how much of the political science literature to cover. But anyway, I think taking a gendered lens to conflict is very easily motivated. So for example, the UN 2024 report records more than 170 armed conflicts and 612 million women and girls living within 50 kilometers of these conflicts, which is a 150% increase relative to a decade ago. And now 90% of war casualties are civilians. The majority of these are women and children. So the proportion of females killed in armed conflict in 2023 doubled compared to the previous year. As we've already sort of discussed as well, the armed conflicts and associated violations leads to large-scale forced internal displacement, refugee flows, and these are also 75% of displaced people are women and children. Some refugee populations, they constitute 90%. Internally displaced people, women disproportionately affected by the loss of livelihoods. For example, a lot of the displaced households are female-headed. Currently, so just an example from current day Yemen, 80% of the 4.5 million people displaced are women and children. And what's another big factor is the fact of gender-based violence during conflict. So the most dominant form of gender-based violence in armed conflict is sexual. So the UN defines this as rape, sexual slavery, forced prostitution, forced pregnancy, forced abortion, and forced sterilization, and things like forced marriage. And rape of women has long been an endemic feature of war. So just some rough estimates, so 25 to 50,000 Bosnian women, girls raped women and raped girls during the Bosnian War, a quarter to 500,000 girls raped, women and girls raped in the Rwandan genocide, more than 60,000 during the civil war in Sierra Leone. 48 rapes took place every hour during the height of the conflict in the Eastern DRC. And recently, the UN verified cases of just which occurred in 2024 were 50% higher compared to the year before. And just as even more motivation, as this is an important area of research, is for centuries, perpetrators of these sexual attacks essentially enjoyed effective impunity. It was only in 2008 that the UN dictated this to be a war crime or a crime against humanity. Going on with this gender-based violence is this idea of forced marriages, right? So these combatants are able to take these women forcibly and assign them as wives. And a bunch of groups have been involved in doing this, like the Khmer Rouge of Cambodia, the Boko Haram, the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda is a really well-known case. Myanmar, Sierra Leone, and that is not an international crime. That's still up for debate. So it's not explicitly codified in any criminal statute. It has been dealt with in certain special appeals courts, or certain commanders have been prosecuted, but it's not an international crime. And women are not just victims, they're also actors in conflict. So historically, they've had a role of combatants, part of organized civil society, human rights defenders, members of resistance movements, and so forth. And the global community repeatedly calls for ensuring women's participation in conflict prevention. And this is sort of because of all this work. They think all else equal, women are more poised to support peace and less conflictual and so forth. And UN reports power and decision-making, though, on peace and security matters remain overwhelmingly dominated by men. So, for example, women made up only 9% of negotiators in peace processes in 2023. So I think it's very easy to motivate taking a gendered lens to the conflict literature. So as I said, there's a very active cross-disciplinary literature on this, on gender inequality in conflict and post-conflict settings. So in our review, we sort of tried to just stick to the quantitative, causally identified papers that we could come by. And we sort of take two overarching perspectives, women as victims and women as actors in conflict. And the core sections are sort of explaining the incidence of gender-based violence in conflict zones, understanding the longer-term gender-based consequences of conflict in conflict settings and post-conflict settings, explaining the incidence and implications of female actors in conflict, understanding the role of women in peace building, and finally just trying to see what gender-based policies there are. And essentially, it's only two that economists have contributed substantially. So there's very little and everything else. And if there's anything, it's mainly done in the political science literature in terms of quantitative studies, is my reading so far, our reading. So there's, so just with regards to gender-based violence, a lot of this, most of the documentation, most of the discussion of it comes from case studies. There's enormous scope for causal empirical investigations. Of course, core questions are what determines, gender-based violence in certain contexts and not other contexts, different forms of gender-based violence, and just why do some actors commit it and others don't. So the political science literature on this, as far as I can tell, sort of thinks of it as three main reasons for committing this. One is a tactic of war with intentional purpose. One is tolerated but not ordered by superiors. Another is just rogue combatants opportunistically behave this way. So, as a tactic of war, it's employed as a weapon to provoke terror, dishonor, demoralize, and emasculate the enemy. It's even an intention of genocide. You impregnate women, then that eradicates the ethnic bloodline. As a practice of war, it's not directly ordered, but it could be seen as a way of payment. So especially these forced marriages, combatants take these wives. It's sort of akin to looting. And then the opportunistic sexual behavior, sort of these random events, sort of the social morals of a society break down in the time of war, and men behave sort of differently in these kind of cultural breakdown, runaway norms contexts. And so that's sort of, and then but what also is happening in political science is these very interesting databases. So in economists, Eleanor is an exception, she's used one of these, but essentially we haven't investigated them. So I think the most comprehensive one is one that builds on the UCDP data set and tries to, and codes up every conflict in that it involved sexual violence. There is a sexual violence category in ACLED, but there's these other data sets that political scientists have tried to work on. So one of collective rape, sexual violence just by security forces, and so forth. So I think there's a lot of potential to sort of build on these and also use these data sets. So just looking at the sexual violence and armed conflict, this is sort of the cross-country variation that we observe. So first, from an economist perspective, we're just like, what's determining this variation, right? And so it's just immediate work that can be done. And what you do see, so they've looked, so the political scientists have looked at sort of some kind of correlates, but essentially, you know, the prevalence of sexual violence varies dramatically by perpetrator group. The sexual violations are common, but not ubiquitous. So even within the same conflict, the same country, complex setting, some armed groups will commit it and others won't. So this is sort of really curious questions as to why. What you do see is state militaries are more likely to be perpetrators of sexual violence compared to either rebel groups or militia. And one thing you see too is if the sexual violence happened in conflict, it typically persists after conflict at very high levels sometimes. And so there's really less than a handful of papers in economics trying to understand, you know, this variation. So Eleonora's, you know, very nice paper on the cultural factors, so showing that groups that have very biased, gender-biased norms are more likely to commit this sexual violence, and also an interesting dichotomy that if the perpetrator perceives, you know, the position of women as a threat to their ideals, they'll even commit it more. So the relative gender-biased norms play a role. And then there's, you know, just two papers at the moment looking at the economic factors. So one looking at an increase in artisanal mining. Artisanal mining increases it, so thinking of it as a tax, it's working as a tax, serves as a non-lethal mean for armed groups to enforce a high taxation rate while preserving a labor force, using a labor force. And then there's the obvious one of poverty. When you're really poor, you will sell off your daughter in a forced marriage. So you know, there's really almost nothing. So there's a huge amount of work to be done. So this is where economists have contributed. And this sort of touches a little bit on the work of Michaela that was talked about yesterday. So there's a work of what are the consequences of conflict on gender-based outcomes. And the most studied one, I say, is intimate partner violence. Secondly is just education and health outcomes, forced displacement, and demographic shifts. I'll just go through these quickly. Maybe there's significant empirical work demonstrates, so just exploiting exposure to conflict, either by, you know, cross-sectional variation or by year of marriage, year of birth, that kind of, and you just see overwhelmingly in all these different contexts an increase in experience of intimate partner violence. Okay, so if you've been exposed to conflict, you are more likely to experience intimate partner violence. So why? So one is the normalization of violence. So war sort of creates a I mean, these are hypotheses, again, discussed more in the political science literature, but war just has a desensitizing effect. So the perception of violence and to create sort of a dehumanized view of victims. There's also social repercussions of war trauma. So men are more likely to commit it if they've been traumatized by war. So we sort of see this. There's a paper in the US of women married to US former combatants are more likely to experience sexual violence, IPV, and similar, if they have a paper in the Angola example, where if these combatants were themselves exposed to sexual violence in war, they're more likely to come back and commit it when they got back. Another thing is amplification of patriarchal norms. So you do see these other aspects. If you're exposed to conflict, these other outcomes that are bad for women also get worse, like their autonomy within the households are worse. And you do see that, and one possibility, so you've got these papers that show an increase in IPV if you're exposed to military bases. So even local, you live near a local military base. So that would be another example of that. This sort of another outcome that's looked at is related to the talk from yesterday, which is these health and educational outcomes. So just a lack of essential services. And the narrative in the policy sort of speak and like international organizations is, yeah, women seem to be disproportionately affected by this. I would say the empirical evidence thus far isn't so concrete on this. So certainly it seems that when, they're worse for reproductive outcomes. So women do suffer health reproductive outcomes, and there is a little bit of support that educational outcomes are worse for girls. But there are a lot of outcomes like health, vaccination rates, things of children that actually they're just equally boys and girls suffer. So I would say this is not as clear. As I mentioned, there's a big motivation for studying women in the context of forced displacement. And again, like 5 papers or 4 papers, right? So they're essentially comparing refugee status to to native groups. And you do see some things like women's outcomes are worse, but it's not clear it's worse than men, right? So this isn't necessarily a relative study. I think the demographic aspect, which was also touched upon yesterday, is a big literature. This is one economists have contributed to. And it's just simply that wars take more male lives. So you have a biased sex ratio in the population that lasts just for 1 generation, right? So it's sort of interesting that the effects tend to last much longer than that. So women enter into the labor force taking up these positions, either of power, even political positions or employment positions. And a lot of this, I won't go into this. I mean, the work's been, the well-known papers first came out of studying the world wars in the US and so forth. But I think more recent work is showing the persistence of this long time and just even gender bias. So norms are better now if they had if they lost a lot of men at one point in the past. So this is true of the Rwanda genocide, the Triple Alliance, which took like the most number of male lives ever, the Triple Alliance War, and then even the transatlantic slave trade, there's evidence from there. And there's actually this interesting hypothesis, which is the Trivers-Willard hypothesis. And this is more a biological evolutionary hypothesis. So conflict actually leads to sex ratios skewed in favor of women. So females evolve to favor offspring of a particular gender according to their circumstances. So if they're stressed in some way, they're more likely to produce a female offspring. And there's actually evidence of this from the civil conflict in Nepal and even the terrorist attacks in New York in 2001. And so just turning to moving away from women as victims, instead as actors. So they have a big participation in resistance movements. And again, there's this interesting data set that, again, I think economists could really look to. So this is one from, again, by political scientists called WAR, and it's just coding up the 370 rebel organizations fighting in civil conflicts between 46 and 2015. And the majority of rebel organizations include women. Half are actually on the front line. These aren't just, in these other type of jobs. A quarter in the military hierarchy, and it's more common in leftist groups. And this is just to show you the distribution geographically. And again, so many questions and so many interesting future investigations. And so the one thing that political scientists have touched on a tiny bit, a couple of papers in economics, is looking at how this feeds into political participation of women. So if they were active in rebel groups, they are more likely to later on be in political roles, and actually increases their likelihood of engaging in peace talks. And what's interesting was there's a couple of papers that show that their success in politics actually depends on whether that rebel group committed sexual violence. So if they did actually commit sexual violence, then their success as being elected politically is worse. And just turning now to policy, there's almost very little. So the landmark, I'm going to be done before that, yeah. So the landmark resolution of the UN Security Council in 2000 just affirmed this important role for women in the prevention and resolution of conflicts, peace negotiations, peace building, and so forth. And you sort of wonder why. There's not a huge amount of evidence. But anyway, it does correspond to this negative correlation you see. So I'll just show you. So this is an indicator of gender equality, which I just took, which is legal equality. So it's the simplest measure of equality. Norms, if there's legal inequality, is going to be definitely not norm inequality. So this is kind of an upper, sort of biased upwards of measure of gender equality. And this is just, you see a stark negative correlation. So this is just the UCDP data. And you see it for all conflicts except for the interstate, which you might expect. And this is robust to including GDP per capita and democracy scores. So I don't know what it means. There's nothing causal, right? But it does point to maybe there's something to think about here. It's such a strong correlation that improved gender equality reduces conflict. And then again, then the main reason people think women should be involved in these peace negotiations is they have these different preferences. And again, there are these interesting databases. So again, the political scientists have coded, the peace agreements database. And so some authors have coded this for all the gender mentioned involved in these peace agreements. And women's involvement is positively correlated to containing special provisions for females, but it is dependent on women holding some position of power. They can't just be sitting in the room of those negotiations. And a female combatant prevalence is also associated with peace terms advocating for equality of women. So that's another interesting avenue of research. The only other policies I could think of that involve gender in conflict is the community-driven development programs, the CDD, which are sort of not as popular now, but they went into war-torn countries, right? And they would have a mandate of female quotas. So they were going in sort of, typically giving a big amount of cash to, or resources to certain areas. And there's been these RCT evaluations of them in Sierra Leone, DRC, and Afghanistan. And the only successful program in terms of women's well-being was the one in Afghanistan. And there they mandated gender-balanced village development council, equal participation of women in the council elections, and selection of development projects. And then the only other aspect that's not directly related to conflict, is something that was touched upon yesterday as well, is just these standard microcredit RCT evaluations that happen in post-conflict settings. But that's kind of tangential to the conflict issue. But just like you see positive effects of giving microcredit to women in other contexts, you see a little bit in the post-conflict. But that's not super informative. You can imagine there's so much more to do in this area. So just to sum up, so there's significant research has been done to sort of identify serious long-term consequences of exposure of gender-based violence to armed conflict. Far less identifying why that exists in the first place. What are the key determinants? Why do some actors engage in this and others don't? Women have active roles in conflict. They are the majority of rebel groups. There's very little quantitative causal work trying to understand which groups do this, what are the implications. So I think we can borrow from the innovative data sets already in political science and also build on them. The political role of women in post, again, there's this massive global agenda, but almost very little work to sort of understand it. Again, innovative collective political science data sets to use, but also a lot of potential for amalgamating new data sets, essentially with large language models. There's tons of written about any peace negotiation, who was involved. So there's lots to do on that. And I think also there's, the whole focus has been on women in these sort of formal environments, but of course there's all the informal grassroots movements. And again, no work that I have seen quantitatively predicting how that impacts things in the post-conflict setting. And finally, there's almost no policy targeting, so all these consequences for women because of conflict, there's all this gender-based violence during conflict, and no policies targeting this directly. So you can imagine a huge scope for experimental work aimed directly evaluating policies to reduce GBV and other gender-based behaviors seems paramount. Of course, it's very challenging in conflict settings, but in the very least post-conflict settings. And I also think there's great potential for theoretical work. So conceptualizing formally why some actors would engage with this and others not. Theoretical frameworks which explicitly address the political economy forces of tensions determining participation or exclusion of women in peace building and conflict resolution. This is a huge open area of research for economists. Okay, so thank you.
All right, thank you very much for this very fascinating presentation. I learned a lot. I'm not an expert on the topic, so for me it was like most of the literature was brand new. I didn't know it, and I like the blend of economics and political science. I also like very much the way you frame your discussion. I think that's it's a beautiful way of thinking about the issue, where you have female as victims, female as actors, and then you look at what happens during conflict, what happens after conflict. I was thinking whether you can add the diagram in the paper to summarize, because I think because there's so much, it's packed, of course, because it's a very complex issue. There are many papers looking at different features of the topic. I was wondering whether you can kind of, add the table or a diagram to summarize all the dynamics. Now, in terms of the first one, you have during conflict, female as victims, you're looking at sexual violence, and there's quite a lot of literature on this. Forced marriage is another issue. And you know how women sometimes in the long run, they normalize abuses, which is a worrying kind of long-term persistent effect of conflict. Now, in this respect, I was wondering whether you can a little bit talk about what happens in the short run versus in the long run, which seems to be crucial. When you talk about females as actors, you stress the role of females as leaders in rebel movements and how they achieve leadership roles. Now, here, what is unclear in the literature, and I don't think we have an answer, is whether female they push their way into resistance movements or they're pulled into. So where is the agency there? It's unclear. I don't think you will find an answer, but it's just I think it's food for thought. How does it work? Maybe more detail. Are they active? Are they seeking an active role, or maybe just rebel movements? They need female participation for political reasons or for strategic reasons. We don't know. So that's something which is unclear in the literature. So after conflict, again, you very nicely distinguish between females as victims and females as actors. What are the, again, here it would be interesting to see what are the long-term versus short-term consequences. Some of the studies, they persistently show there is an impact on intimate partner violence, and it would be interesting to see whether we know anything about duration of this effect. And again, females as actors, here again, the agency I think is crucial. How do they are they seeking a role, and why? How does it work? So in terms of contribution, so when you look at these studies, as I said, you're looking at the during conflict and after conflict. What happens before conflict, though? It's something which is unclear. Now, there are not many studies on gender as a determinant of conflict, but you might look at the impact of gender discrimination on whether this might kind of can have an effect compounded with something else on the odds of having or experiencing the onset of civil wars. But there is also literature on, it's called the youth bulge literature, looking at the ratio between female and male, and why having a surplus of young male could be a driver of conflict, because this creates frustration. Not only civil wars, I'm talking about all kinds of violence, political violence, crime as well. There's literature on crime. I'm not super convinced about the theory behind it, but it might be worth at least mentioning this strand of literature. Now, one question for you is why you're using inequalities in the title, because only a subset of your studies, they talk to the issue of inequalities. So what do you mean by inequalities in more details? So I understand we're talking about unequal access to education and health, but everything else doesn't seem to be related to the idea of inequalities. Now, many studies, they do show persistently an impact of conflict on violence against women, but then I was wondering whether it's just part of a general pattern of violence. You have conflict and you have more violence against women, child soldiering, and many other kind of spillovers. Is it gender specific, or is part of a broader increase in violence which affects also women? That's something unclear. Also, what are the puzzles there? So what is some of the findings, they look to me very well established, where others are not so much. So I was wondering whether you can clarify what we know very well and what is still unclear. And the other question is why now? So we're talking about very old theories here, but most of the studies you are citing are very recent. Many are very, very recent, 2023, 2024. Why are we just evolving as a discipline and we want to study more this issue? Or it's just because we have more data? Given that we have more data, so is the data driven, the interest, or maybe we're more sensitive to the issue. And the other question is what can be done. I don't think there is any answer to this, but if you can speculate about what are the potential solutions available to the international community. Now, what is, in my view, the problem with these studies is the data. I think the data are terrible. Can we trust data on gender violence? I don't think we can. So there are two typologies of data here. You have survey data, survey-based data set, and some data sets are based on media reports. I think they're both terrible. The survey data, obviously, there is an issue about stigma, shame, lack of trust. Why should they report gender-based violence? I mean, what are the repercussions of underreporting in this case? I think desirability and all this sort of psychological dynamics will impact the way our information about gender violence. When you look at data which are media-based, okay, so media reports, there's another issue. There is an issue about sampling bias. Loads of violence in Africa and other countries, they happen in rural areas, and we have no idea about what's going on there. Okay, and this obviously affects also the way we have a picture about gender violence. In many cases, we don't know. So you have a lot of reporting of violence in urban areas, very little in rural areas, and this is a problem. Some of the findings you are mentioning, for example, state militaries are more likely to be perpetrators of sexual violence compared to rebels. Are they? I mean, maybe it's just they're just more visible. It's easier. It's more likely to report violence when it's perpetrated by state militaries. Hence, we believe they are more likely to be perpetrators when they're not. There is also in this data set, I'm not saying that we should not use them, but we should take them with a pinch of salt. They are very inconsistent in the way they define gender-based violence. The definition is crucial. And the way and this makes your life much more difficult when you compare the data. You have very nice figures, very nice maps. I was wondering whether the data correlates, because they're using different definitions of gender-based violence, and they're also using different sources. I would be interested to see the degree, the kind of correlations between different sources. Okay, so when you talk about extant studies, there is also an issue about mechanism. What are the mechanisms? And this relates to my previous point about agency, to what extent they are pulled into rebel movements or resistance movements, whether they push their way into it, how does it happen in more details. We could also add some anecdotal evidence, some story about what happened, some examples to have a sense of what's going on, the dynamics there. And as I said previously, some of the research is very well established. So we know that conflict will lead to an increase in intimate partner violence. That's something which is quite established. I was wondering whether then the sides of the effect, what is, because you shy away from discussing the magnitude, right? But for some studies, I think the effect is quite small, which doesn't mean it's not important, but I would like to see a little bit more about the sides. And you also, you're very nice in the way you discuss the methods. You don't want to get involved into debates about correlation, identification. You mentioned when the evidence is correlational, but even when the evidence is kind of causal, do you have anything to say about the methods they're using? Are they rigorous enough? Are you convinced about what they're doing? Particularly when you use IVs and other stuff, can you add a little bit more about whether we should buy the methods? All right, thank you for this enlightening presentation.
Thanks, Siwan, for writing this review. I think we needed this as economists. And I'm actually curious to hear your thoughts on why it's taking us so long to get to these topics as economists, because political scientists, sociologists have thought about these topics and gender in war so much. And it's embarrassing how little we've done as economists. So going to your point, so by now we have this massive literature on IPV, intimate partner violence, right? And if it's really an issue of data, well, the same issue of underreporting may be there also for IPV, right? We also, I think, all agree, I think political scientists as well agree that gender-based violence in war is really an independent phenomenon. It's not an inevitable byproduct of war that just comes, with all the other types of violence that are perpetrated. We also know that it's extremely costly. So after reviewing all this literature, what are your thoughts and why do you think we are taking so long? So there is work by Victoire as well on the topic. So yes, I am still very puzzled by this, and I'm curious to hear what you think, given you've worked on reviewing the literature so well. Thanks.
I was wondering whether you want to review or get into the literature of pornography, this kind of revenge porn kind of stuff. Now the AI version of this, where like images are spread and it's kind of, I don't know, it's violence or I don't know. It seems relevant in this kind of whole gender/conflict debate. Yeah. I also sent you some references. The German government is very strong, and then feminist foreign policy for some stage. Now Spain has taken the lead, and I think this is motivated to a large degree by the kind of work that you're summarizing, and then of course this this amazing pattern that you showed. I think that was a clear impetus to this policy approach.
Yeah, very interesting piece. I think it's definitely timely. I was kind of wondering why you didn't decide to delve into the side of the literature, like this Queen's article by Dubé and Harish, right? Like some of the literature on how women policymakers shape the incidence of conflict, mostly interstate conflict, I guess, in the literature. Because it strikes me that that's like something that policymakers really believe. I mean, there's lots of quotes by people like Obama and Clinton saying, more women in executive office is going to lead to a more peaceful world. And my sense of the political science literature is that that's actually like not the reality because of gender stereotypes. Women have incentives to engage in like more conflict to counteract this perception that they're weak on national security. So that might be an interesting angle to incorporate.
Thank you. This was super interesting. I think the amount of question shows our collective excitement about this topic. I was wondering if there's any work about biases in a specific type of violence against civilians, which is the one where rebels or any group is trying to kind of punish collaboration, right? Because this is the major form of violence against civilians in many asymmetric conflicts. And women play a particular role there because if groups inflict this violence, they often do it under some constraint of keeping kind of the population, not kind of upsetting them too much, being transparent in how they target, how they punish. And I was wondering if we know something about the willingness of groups to punish women. And that relates a bit to these push and pull factors, perhaps, because my sense is that one of the reasons why women have been so involved in resistance movement is that there might have been an expectation, whether rational or not, that it was less likely that they would be caught and conditional on getting caught if they would be punished. And that's like a reflection, that I didn't see this. Perhaps there's no work on this, but.
Wanted to follow up on a question by Leonora and Vincenzo. So, female violence in conflict, even if you look back in history, is a bit part of the price for soldiers of organized army. So we have a lot of instances in which part of the payment that you give to soldier is looting, and looting ultimately is about extracting utility, typically is food or alcohol and women. And there are a lot of instances. So in that respect, it is a peculiar type of conflict. But on the other hand, I think the question by Vincenzo is a crucial one. Is it just that whenever you have women in a conflict situation, this is just part of the utility or the outcome of conflict, or do you have more systematic reason? And you touch upon some of those. In some cases, there seems to be something else than that. And of course, there is a question on how do we measure, but again, without a theory or at least an hypothesis, it's difficult to tell apart. So I actually find it a bit puzzling as well that rebels engaging in violence differently than state armies. Of course, state armies in history, that was part of the price to soldiers, but then you see, generally is less tolerated today. But there are instances, for instance, the very birth of Rome with the Rath delle Sabine, they were running short. They needed to increase the population side. They had no women and they moved to Sabine, 100 kilometers to the north. They took all the women. And so I think it is important to try to tell apart more systematically whether this is just, women are just a special victim of war because of, or whether there is something else, and try to use it to check and understand how to look into the data. Because sometimes maybe it doesn't square. So if the issue is just it is an incidental victim, then maybe you can think about it. And then the other thing is, I understand that as economists we want to have hard data, but this is an instance in which specific case study documented with other information could be useful. So do you have some side information on that? For instance, for World War II, we have instances of violence with the Germans retreating to the north, nothing against the German, obviously, but they were actually studied because they were punished and they were specific commanders. So there are specific, you see, the details matter a bit in this, into understanding, I think.
Yeah, so thank you very much for all these comments and for the excellent discussion. Yeah, I mean, I haven't, so I think it would be, I think I take from this that I should do more, we should do more work. So because this is sort of, it's really in the realm of political science. So there are a ton of case studies. We could discuss those. We could go into that data more. So even this militia state forces differences, that's just in this coding of this 370 rebel groups. That's a sample from a particular regions that they studied. It's kind of like the anthropologists, they go into a certain area, study. It's similar. They're studying these certain rebel groups, right? So there's a huge issue with data. Why it's such a topic? I think it's data, right? But also I think, to be truthful, the conflict literature has been dominated by sort of men studying it, to be honest, right? So I think that could play a part of it. But just even then, collecting data on IPV is notoriously difficult. So collecting data on violence during conflict, I mean, how hard, that's so hard, right? Collecting reliable data. So anyway, I don't know, but yeah, and I think it's interesting to think we could bring in other violence, so violence against children. That's another one we have almost no information on. And again, there's burgeoning data sets in political science on trying to get at this. But yeah, sort of get at whether it's just violence against others. And just with this rebel group, it's true. So they are careful with whether you can distinguish whether they're coming in more as the forced wife situation, or kind of even a domestic worker that's sort of enforced in a version of kind of enslaved labor almost, and having a big role. But I think it's very interesting when they do have, the FARC, for example, is a super famous group example where women are actually these powerful leaders. And there's an interesting paper in economics showing that, when the FARC leaders interact with the female political leaders, that they're able to reduce conflict, and they're both female. So there's sort of these gender synergies. But I think in general, I sort of take away from this to read more for the piece. So but also on the leadership stuff in the political scientists, the role of women. Again, we didn't review a ton of the papers because it's not, as you mentioned, not causally identified up to the econ standards, but it's certainly, because the topic's so new, maybe we should bring that in more and not worry about that so much. Because I think there's a lot of wisdom in these other disciplines. So yeah. But anyway, thank you. I'll take all these comments to heart. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So then let me thank Dominic and Oliver on behalf of all of us for bringing us here to this beautiful conference. Let me thank the CPR team for setting it up in a way that was very, very smooth, and it's CESifo local organizers as well. It was fantastic. I don't know whether you want to say something. So thanks a lot.
Well, I mean, Well, first of all, well, let's Mariolina. So thanks so much. Special. And also Emma, of course. And then we don't have 100,000, well, and then CESifo as well, as represented by the president. And then we don't have 100,000 smart things to add. One thing was just logistical, that in principle, you know, the deadline for the papers and the discussions to be published is the 1st of August. I hope you remember this. So that's kind of a really important thing. And you're going to get a recap email with some you know, logistical details linked to the publication soonish. And
no, I think I have nothing to add. Just to repeat that, like you know, the discussion is like 1 or 2 pages, and we really like we want to kind of decentralize this process as much as possible. So it would be like it's important to somehow coordinate with your discussant about like what points you will take on in the revised paper and what is left for like the separate discussion. But I think like I mean for most papers we saw, like there was not like, you know, a lot of additional work like left to be done. And similarly, I think all discussions, they were like super high quality, and they kind of easily had like, you know, points that could be developed separately. So I think that's great. I also want to discuss like you know, thank everyone, but the discussants in particular, it's not always kind of very kind of rewarding to like go to a conference without being able to present your own work, right? So I mean it is a big effort, but it's something that's important, and that we really appreciate. Although yeah. The beautiful location might have been able to compensate a bit, but still. Thanks everyone.